The apartment felt smaller than ever that evening, suffocating almost, as though the walls themselves were closing in on me. I had been dreading this moment for days, knowing the inevitable confrontation was coming, but no amount of preparation could have made it easier. Bills were stacked neatly on the counter, reminders of every failed attempt to keep things afloat. Rent was overdue, and with each passing day, the tension in the house grew heavier. I tried to keep calm, tried to reason with them both, but my words felt fragile, like paper in a storm. My mom's voice cut through the silence like a knife, sharp and unrelenting. "Pay rent or get out," she yelled, each word dripping with anger and frustration. Her face was tense, her eyes flashing, and I could feel the heat of her rage spreading through the room. I wanted to explain, wanted to tell her that we were trying, that I was trying, but the words stuck in my throat. They sounded hollow and weak compared to the fury that filled the air. I could see the disappointment in her eyes, the exhaustion of someone who had given everything and felt like it was slipping away. Dad, who had been silent until then, suddenly turned toward me. I had seen that look before, the tight jaw, the narrowing eyes, the muscles coiled like a spring ready to snap. I should have stepped back, I should have left the room, but I froze instead, trapped in the weight of what was happening. Before I could react, his hand shot out. The slap hit me hard across my face, and pain exploded instantly, sharper and colder than I could have imagined. I felt myself stumble, my knees buckling, and then I was on the floor. Blood was warm against my cheek, trickling down slowly, and for a moment, the world seemed to stop. I stared at the floor, dazed, trying to understand what had just happened. I could hear Dad muttering something under his breath, his voice heavy with anger, but the words were meaningless, distorted by the ringing in my ears. My mom's face was a mixture of shock and fury, her hands clenching into fists, but she didn't step in. She had screamed, she had warned, and somehow that wasn't enough. Somehow, I had still ended up here, on the floor, bleeding, humiliated, and terrified. Then I looked up and saw my child. Wide eyes, glistening with unshed tears, staring at me with a confusion that tore through my chest. How could I explain this? How could I make sense of violence that had no reason, that had no justification? My heart ached, not just for myself but for the small person clinging to my leg, trying to understand why the world suddenly seemed so cruel. I wanted to scoop them up, hold them close, and protect them from the ugliness that had invaded our home, but even that simple act felt impossible in the chaos that surrounded us. Every second stretched endlessly, each one heavier than the last. I felt a mix of emotions, pain, fear, shame, and an overwhelming sadness. How had it come to this? How had the people I loved, the people I trusted most, become the ones who hurt me the most? It wasn't just the physical pain that tore through me, it was the betrayal, the shattering of safety, the realization that the people who should protect me had become the source of my terror. I tried to stand, shaking, the room tilting around me, my blood leaving a trail across the cold floor. I needed to get up, to do something, anything, to make the nightmare stop. But every movement was a struggle. The pain radiated through my face, sharp and relentless, making it hard to think, hard to breathe. My child reached for me, tiny hands pressing against my chest, and I felt an overwhelming surge of protectiveness. I had to be strong, had to survive, had to make sure they were safe even if I wasn't. In that moment, I realized that life as I knew it had changed forever. Nothing would be the same again. The apartment, the arguments, the moments that had once seemed insignificant, all of it had shifted into something unrecognizable. I was no longer just living under a roof, I was living under a storm, and that storm had names and faces I once trusted. And yet, even in the midst of the fear, pain, and confusion, a small spark of determination ignited within me. I would not let this moment define me, nor would I let it define my child. Somehow, we would find a way out, find a way to heal, find a way to rebuild a life where we could feel safe again. But first, I had to survive this night, had to endure the humiliation, the blood, the shock, and the broken trust. I wiped the blood from my face with trembling hands, trying to gather myself, trying to breathe, trying to convince my mind that the world hadn't completely collapsed. My child clung to me, their little arms wrapping around my waist, their trust unwavering even when everything else had failed. In their eyes, I saw hope, and it was fragile, but it was there. And I knew that for them, I had to rise, had to fight, had to keep going even when it felt impossible. Pain and fear flooded my body, but beneath it all, determination settled in like a steady flame. This was the breaking point, yes, but also the beginning of something new. A life where we could escape the violence, the shouting, the humiliation. A life where my child could grow up knowing love without fear. And though the road ahead seemed impossible, I took a deep, shuddering breath, wiped my tears, and prepared myself for whatever would come next. The apartment felt heavy with silence, but it wasn't the peaceful kind, it was the suffocating, thick silence that comes after a storm. I was still on the floor, my face stinging, blood dripping down, my chest heaving with each shallow breath. My child clung to me, tiny arms wrapped around my waist, their forehead pressed against mine, searching for answers in a world that had suddenly become cruel and incomprehensible. I tried to steady my breathing, tried to calm the shaking that ran through my body, but fear had rooted itself deep inside me, and it refused to leave. Dad's angry muttering filled the room in the background, but it sounded distant, almost like a dream. The rage that had been directed at me earlier now seemed to float in the air, impossible to touch, impossible to change. I could feel the weight of everything pressing down, the years of tension, the failed expectations, the arguments that had built up silently over time, now exploding in a way that left no room for recovery. And yet, despite it all, my child's wide, terrified eyes were on me, and that sight pierced through the fog of pain and humiliation. I had to protect them. That had to be my focus. I gathered my strength slowly, painfully, pushing myself up from the floor. Every movement sent sharp pain across my face, reminding me of what had just happened, of the violation of trust, of the violence I had endured. But I couldn't remain on the floor any longer, not with my child looking to me for safety. I brushed my hands against my face, trying to clean the blood, trying to make myself presentable, even though I knew the bruises would linger long after the cuts had healed. My child whispered my name, voice trembling, and I swallowed hard to steady myself, forcing a small, reassuring smile. We had to leave. That much was clear. Staying in this apartment, under this roof, in the shadow of someone who could harm us without warning, was no longer an option. But the thought of leaving terrified me just as much as the violence itself. Where could we go? How could we survive? There were no easy answers, and yet, the urgency of the situation pushed me forward. I had to find a way out, had to create safety for both of us, even if it meant stepping into the unknown. I gathered what little belongings we could carry quickly, keeping one hand on my child the entire time. Each item packed felt heavy, not because of its weight, but because it symbolized the life we were leaving behind. Photos, clothes, small mementos of a time when life had seemed simpler, safer, now they were just reminders of what had been lost. My child clutched a small stuffed toy, their tiny fingers gripping it as if it were a lifeline, and I felt a surge of protectiveness so strong it almost overwhelmed me. We couldn't go back. We couldn't stay. Our only choice was forward. The journey out of the apartment was quiet but tense. Every step I took felt like a risk, every sound echoed in my ears, making my heart race. Outside, the street was dimly lit, the shadows stretching long and menacing. I held my child close, whispering soft reassurances, even though I wasn't entirely sure I believed them myself. I had to be the strong one, the protector, the guide. My child depended on me to navigate this new, terrifying reality, and I refused to let them down. As we moved further away from the apartment, a strange mix of emotions washed over me, relief that we had escaped the immediate danger, fear of the uncertain road ahead, and a deep, aching sadness for the life we had been forced to leave behind. Each step carried the weight of what had happened, and yet, each step also carried a glimmer of hope, a tiny spark that maybe, just maybe, we could find safety, peace, and a life free from fear. We found temporary refuge in a small, quiet corner of the city, away from the chaos and shouting, away from the violence. I held my child close, feeling their small body trembling against mine. We were safe for now, but I knew this was only the beginning. The night stretched on, long and uncertain, filled with the echoes of what had happened, the memories of the slap, the blood, the fear in my child's eyes. Sleep came only fitfully. Each time I closed my eyes, the images replayed relentlessly, refusing to release me from their grip. Yet, in the quiet moments between panic and exhaustion, a new determination began to grow inside me. I could not let this define us. We had been through something terrible, something that no one should ever endure, but we had survived. That alone was a small victory, and it was enough to give me the strength to plan the next steps. We would find help, we would find support, and we would rebuild. My child deserved a life where fear was not a constant companion, and I would do everything in my power to provide it. The journey ahead was uncertain, filled with obstacles and challenges I could not yet see, but one thing was clear: we were no longer prisoners of that apartment, no longer trapped in the shadow of violence. We had each other, and that was a beginning. I held my child tighter, feeling their warmth, their fragile trust, and I made a silent promise that I would protect them at all costs. No matter how difficult the path, no matter how deep the fear, we would endure. We would survive. And someday, we would find a life where love did not hurt, where safety was not a distant dream, and where my child could grow up knowing that the world, despite its cruelty, could also hold kindness, hope, and love. And as dawn broke over the city, spilling pale light across the streets, I felt, for the first time in hours, a small sense of possibility. We had made it through the night. We had survived the worst. And somewhere in that survival, amidst the pain and fear, there was hope, a fragile, trembling hope that we could rise, heal, and find a future that was ours, free from violence, free from fear, and filled with the love and safety my child deserved. The days after that night were heavy with silence, but it wasn't peaceful silence. It was the kind that presses down on your chest, the kind that makes every breath feel like a struggle. We had escaped the immediate danger, but the trauma followed us like a shadow, unrelenting and suffocating. I watched my child closely, noticing every flinch, every hesitant movement, every question they didn't ask but their eyes screamed. The innocence of their gaze, the trust they had in me, was both a comfort and a reminder of what I had to protect. I had survived the violence, but I had to survive for them, too. Sleep was elusive. Every time my eyes closed, I saw the moment replayed, the slap, the blood, the confusion on my child's face. I could still hear Dad's voice echoing in my head, heavy with anger, and I shivered despite the warmth of the small, temporary room we had found. The apartment we had fled from was still there, with its walls and memories, but it no longer felt like home. It was a place of fear, a place where love had twisted into something unrecognizable, and I could not go back. Yet the uncertainty of the future weighed equally on me. Where would we go? How would we survive? And most importantly, how could I shield my child from the memory of what had happened? I spent hours pacing the small room, running my hands over my face, the bruises still tender, the cuts still stinging. My child followed me like a shadow, tiny hand in mine, seeking comfort in the only constant left in the world, their mother. I whispered soft reassurances, trying to convince them that everything would be okay, even when I wasn't sure I believed it myself. There was fear, yes, and pain, yes, but beneath it all, a determination began to rise. We had survived the first step. That meant we could take the next, and somehow, eventually, we could reclaim our lives. I knew we needed help. The weight of what had happened was too much to bear alone. I reached out quietly, cautiously, to friends I could trust, to support networks, to anyone who could offer guidance or shelter. Each call, each message, was a risk. I had to be careful not to alert my past, not to invite further danger. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, a plan began to take shape. We would find a safe place, rebuild our routines, and create a life where fear was no longer the backdrop of every day. My child needed stability, and I needed to reclaim a sense of control that had been stolen from me. The hardest part, though, was facing the emotional aftermath. My child was quiet, reserved, and at times I could see the shadows of fear lingering in their expressions. I wanted to explain, to give them the words to make sense of it all, but the truth was complicated, messy, and adult. Instead, I focused on creating moments of normalcy, a warm meal, a bedtime story, a small laugh shared over something trivial. Every smile, every moment of play, was a small victory, a thread weaving together a fragile sense of security. It was exhausting, but it was necessary. Days blurred into nights. I began documenting what had happened, not as a cry for vengeance, but as a record of reality. Writing it down helped me process the pain, gave me clarity, and reminded me that what happened was not our fault. The memories were sharp and cruel, but I refused to let them define us. We were more than that night, more than the fear, more than the violence. Slowly, I began to see the strength in myself, a resilience I hadn't recognized before, born of necessity and love. And yet, every day came with new challenges. Fear was not just memory, it was a constant, lingering presence. I double-checked locks, planned routes, and stayed alert to every sound. My child's questions were few, but when they came, I answered with patience and honesty appropriate to their age, avoiding lies but shaping the truth into something they could hold without crumbling. It was a delicate balance, protecting them from harm while also preparing them to understand that the world could be harsh. One morning, as sunlight filtered through the small window of our temporary room, I realized something important: we were surviving. Not just existing, not just hiding, but surviving. Each day we woke, each meal we shared, each laugh, each whispered reassurance, was a victory. I could feel the shift slowly, almost imperceptibly. Fear was still there, yes, but it was no longer the only voice in the room. There was hope, too, fragile and trembling, but present nonetheless. I held my child close and made a promise silently, a promise I intended to keep with every fiber of my being. We would rise above the fear, above the violence, above the memory of that night. We would rebuild, we would heal, and we would create a life filled with love, laughter, and safety. It would not be easy. The scars would remain, physical and emotional, but we would learn to live with them, to grow from them, and to protect each other fiercely. That night, as my child drifted off to sleep in my arms, I felt a quiet sense of determination settle over me. We had survived the storm, escaped the immediate danger, and taken the first steps toward reclaiming our lives. And though the future was uncertain, though challenges and fears awaited us, I knew we would face them together. I whispered softly, more to myself than to anyone else, that we were stronger than the violence, stronger than the fear, and that together, we could find a life where love, safety, and peace were not just dreams but reality.